Well, the house was built by the original settler, whose name was Pierre Langevin, and he had a business running a gas-fired sawmill with his cousin. They went up and down the lake with this sawmill and sawed lumber for all the mining claims that were being set up. At that time, everybody was claiming ore up all the creeks, and none of the mines proved out. But so this farm was actually originally a big cedar swamp. So he cut down all these cedar trees, and then he turned them into lumber. So he built that house out of lumber that he had made out of the cedar trees that grew where the orchard is now. And then he was a single man. He reportedly had a stash of gold coins. When anyone did business with him, he would go outside and come back in with a jar of gold coins. And then the story that we know is that he decided to have a house party, which is very odd because he was apparently a very stingy and not nice person. He went out in a canoe with a young woman, and she came running up about an hour later, saying, this was in the spring, so the water was cold, saying that the canoe had overturned and she had swum to shore, but he did not. And nothing was ever said, but everything disappeared off the farm. He had banknotes and gold coins, and my brother and I turned the farm upside down when we were kids looking for that stash of gold, but we never found it. And he had two cousins in Creston, fairly elderly ladies, and they would come out sometimes and say, if you find those gold coins, they belong to us. And it's like, yeah, like we tell you. So my grandson Louis, who comes here every summer, deeply believes that Pierre Langevin was murdered for his gold, but we have no way of knowing if that's true. And I wouldn't want to slander a young woman, now old woman, that I didn't know, nothing about. So, but it's a good story. And Kootenai Lake is full of bodies. They never float to the surface, so no one ever found Pierre's body or knew what happened to him. But when we were kids and grew up in the old house, he definitely stomped around there at times. He clearly did not want to be dead, and he used to come and slam doors and throw furniture around. And we just knew the house was haunted. We could tell. You would feel cold spots in the house, or sometimes the doors would slam. One time my father was sitting downstairs and the furniture upstairs began to jump around, so we went upstairs and it got quiet. And my mother always had lots of interesting stories. I came to see her one morning for coffee, and she said, "Oh, Luanne, there was this huge gray cat in the house last night with big green glowing eyes. It was sitting beside the bed." And she said, "I turned down the light and I made your father get up. I said, Robbie, there's a huge cat in the house." And she made him search the house, but there was no cat. And so, yeah, we grew up on ghost stories, and then my kids grew up on Grandma's ghost stories. After Pierre drowned, nobody claimed the land, and basically it was auctioned at a government auction for back taxes. And my grandfather had moved to Creston from Saskatchewan. His wife had died, and the drought was on in Saskatchewan, so he came here because he was friends with the bank manager in Creston, and he knew he could get a loan to buy land. So he went to the auction and bid on this farm and got 160 acres of lakeshore in 1938 for $2,525. The 25 was outbidding the other guy who wanted it. Nobody wanted lakeshore. There was no real road to the farm at that time. There was no electricity. There was, it was considered really cold and windy. People did not come out to the lake. It was very inhospitable, really hard to get to. But my grandfather set out to farm it. And then at some point as he got older, he got lonely, so he took 80 acres and made a subdivision of very small lots and sold the lots at a really cheap price to the guys he played poker with, who were most of the, hoi polloi in Creston. So he sold a lot to the pharmacist and to the lawyer and to the banker and to the judge and to all kinds of people, and then had wonderful whiskey drinking, poker playing nights. And so that subdivision is still there, and we all grew up with those people's kids. it rocks on. But the lots are very small, so it's mostly still in various people's families. My mother and father moved here in 1954 because my grandfather wanted to move into Creston, so he more or less gave them the farm. And when we came here from Riondel, my dad had been working in the Bluebell mine. We were all very ill. My mom had rheumatic fever. My dad had lead poisoning because he was working on the docks in Riondel, loading slag into barges, like mine slag, and he was hand rolling cigarettes. And the slag was full of lead and cyanide. So he had actually developed lead poisoning, and no one ever thought to think, to wear gloves or wash their hands, or everybody smoked hand rolled cigarettes. So when we moved here, we've been living in sort of a kind of unfinished house in Riondel. This place was paradise. And I remember the first summer, my father grew this huge field of tomatoes, and I remember him holding up these enormous red tomatoes and eating them. And I loved the farm. I fell in love with it the moment I saw it. I was actually, I'd gotten lost out in the field where the cows were, and the cows were chasing me through the thistles, and then finally I found my father, and I got across the fence, and cows couldn't chase me. And then my father said, well, since you're here, you should be working. So he gave me a can of wheat, and he said, feed the chickens. And so then I shook this can of wheat, and all these banty chickens came running from all over the farm, and they were all different colors, and they all clustered around my feet. And it was late afternoon, so there was this like really vivid emerald light, and I just stood there, and I thought, I'm never leaving. I'm home. This is it. And it was just great. And from then on, the chickens were my responsibility. And we got baby chicks every year. And yeah, so I loved the baby chicks. And then I looked after them when they were adults. So I'm still very fond of chickens. We used to live in the old house, which is beside the highway and has no view. And because my mother felt trapped in the house, she really wanted to be able to see out and look at the lake. So over a long period of time, about 20 years, my father built this house for her. And they were very happy here. They lived here about 20 years. And this house has not changed. This house is exactly the way my father built it. My father began building this house when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And so he blew a basement out of the rocks with dynamite, and we all got him to help. We got to help with that because he liked blowing things up, and so did we. It was really fun. And so we all helped blow up the basement. And then because he had a backhoe tractor business, he cut down all the trees, he hauled them down, he piled them up onto each other with his backhoe, and then he bought a sawmill and made all the lumber for the house. So that's why it took him so long, is he made absolutely everything from scratch. And then he went to yard sales and got all of his electrical and plumbing supplies at yard sales. So it's interesting living in this house because it's very much like living in my father's mind. Everything's sort of okay and kind of works, but sometimes the kind of is a little sketchy. But it's a great house.